Good evening. I'm Steve Target, Chair of the Program Committee of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Jack Templeton Liberty Series. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League and is guided by the United States Constitution and the history and values of the Union League. The foundation's goal is to create more informed, more engaged citizen leaders, and we do this through dozens of programs, lectures, and exhibits, including programs like tonight's Liberty Series. The Liberty Series is named in honor of Jack M. Templeton through a grant from Pina Templeton and through the generous contributions from Union League members and others who share our values. Special thanks also to Jefferson Health for their support of the 2020-2021 Liberty Series programs. Tonight's program will run about an hour in length, and toward the end of the program, our guests will have the opportunity to ask questions and answer questions from our audience. To ask a question, use the question and answer icon located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll get to as many questions as possible. And now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce the moderator for this evening's program, the chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Joan Carter.
Joan, you're muted.
Well, that was a good start. Hello, everyone, again. We're here tonight to become better informed about something that is very important initiative, something from the New York Times that aims to reframe the history of America as a nation founded on slavery, and to use this narrative in teaching American history in our public schools. We're fortunate tonight to have two experts on the topic, Dr. Alan Guelzo, who is, by the way, a Union League member, and he's a noted historian and senior research scholar at the James Madison program at Princeton University. And Alan is joined tonight by Lenny McAllister. Lenny appears regularly as a nationally recognized op-ed writer. He is the director of Western Pennsylvania for the Commonwealth Foundation. He's a political analyst, and we're very happy to welcome both of you here this evening. So, gentlemen, the first thing I want to ask you, Alan, you've written a lot on this topic. What is the 1619 Project?
Well, very simply, Joan, it is an effort to reconceptualize American history and, in effect, to turn American history virtually upside down. The 1619 Project, that's its title, really began in August of 2019 as a 100-page special Sunday issue of the New York Times Magazine. It was under the general direction of Nicole Hannah-Jones, a staff writer for the New York Times editorial board. And in its 100 pages, it featured a collection of articles, commentary, poetry, fiction, some timelines, some illustrations. But all of them taken together were designed to recenter American history and to do it around the experience of slavery. Hence the title, 1619, because 1619 was the year that the first African slaves were landed on the North American coast at the English colony of Jamestown. From that date, 1619, and not 1620 and the Mayflower, not 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. From 1619, the 1619 Project would reckon that the real foundations of America should be understood, and everything in American life comes out of that. This recentering was meant to be not just a reshuffling of the chronology of America to get away from either 1620 or 1776 and be novel and say 1619. No, the object was much more comprehensive, because when the 1619 Project talked about recentering, what it meant was to rewrite all of American history and to do it in a sharply hostile light. So taking 1619 as the year that the first slaves were introduced into the British North American colonies, Nicole Hannah-Jones described everything that flowed into American history after that date as being a product of, as being affected by, as being shaped by, and above all, as being tainted by slavery. And she said, very frankly, no aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. Out of slavery and the anti-Black racism it required grew nearly everything that has truly made American exceptional. And she went into a very long list of things, everything from music, food, then of course, various kinds of inequalities. And the essays that compose the 1619 Project expanded on this by treating American history as a product of the slavery experience in virtually every aspect, from capitalism itself, from the economy, all the way to the way that metropolitan cities had organized their public transit and their highway systems. Everything was a function of slavery and anti-Black racism. So the real founding of America, according to the 1619 Project, the real founding of America begins with an act of oppression that occurs in 1619, not an act of liberty that occurs in 1776. And that act of oppression replicates itself and multiplies itself all through American history, so that at every level, in every era, in every decade, we have to understand that the controlling factor in American history is slavery and anti-Black racism. That explains everything. And taken in a very short compass, that is what the aim of the 1619 Project is when it talks about recentering American history.
Lenny, what do you have to say to that?
There's so much to add to that. Part of what needs to be said as well is the fact that Ms. Hannah-Jones, who, by the way, won a Pulitzer Prize in commentary, not in research, not in any type of historical analysis, but in commentary in regards to the 1619 Project, which is very important because she later defined this project as being an origin story, which is very different than history. Nobody gets an origin story degree from their college, but they do get history degrees. One of the things that is very significant about her work is the fact that it tried to reshape America as being an experiment whose primary purpose was to protect, purport, and expand the practice of slavery, which is extremely different than the narrative of liberty that we hear about when you center our origin around 1776. In fact, it does one even worse. We all often talk about racism and slavery as America's original sin. Based on the 1619 Project, what she's purporting is that this was actually not a sin. It was not something that America even had any type of remorse over. In fact, it was highly intentional. It's always been intentional by the very tenets of America, and thus the oppression that you've seen from different segments throughout America ends up being part of the American experience overall as one of its core values. And that's significant. Because when you're taking something such as the 1619 Project and you start teaching it in schools as history, and you start having young people that don't understand the complexity of American history, where you can have founding fathers that would both own slaves and free slaves, founding fathers that would spark the abolitionist movement, but also ensure that we try to keep the country together. When you start talking about all these different folks from the self-educated all the way through to former slaves being part of what became America, that former slaves were able to buy their freedom in courts in the 1700s. When your focus is the 1619 Project and its tenets, you lose the richness of what America has been, this example of freedom, a place where people from all across the globe have been able to find their destiny in order to pursue life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, where America has constantly been evolving to become a more perfect union. We get stripped of the very essence of what America has been, not just in what we were in the 1600s going to 1776, but the essence of what the American spirit was to help us win World War I, help us win World War II, have the civil rights movement inspire the world towards a higher level of equality, help women get the right to vote, help bring prosperity across the globe. All of those things come from an origin story of 1776 of liberty despite our flaws. If you pivot it towards the 1619 project, all of the values, all of the spirit, all of the inspiration that we bring to all sectors of America and the globe now are in question. And when you start talking about the hostile times that we're in right now, it makes it that much harder to unite our divided country if you can't go to a unifying message of hope that we have seen throughout American history.
Alan, I have understood from some of the things that I've read that you've written that there are an awful lot of inaccuracies, just simply historical inaccuracies in the document, the 1619 Project, that have been sort of corrected and but not actually openly corrected. Can you talk about that?
Well, this was one of the first things that was noticed by people as they were reading the 1619 Project when it originally appeared, and especially those who were historians of early America. Sitting down and reading this was a surreal experience because they were reading what purported to be a description of early American history, which didn't tally with anything they had spent their lives studying. One major, for instance, this way. In the 1619 Project's lead essay, written by Nicole Hannah-Jones, Hannah-Jones argues that one of the primary reasons that the colonists decided to declare their independence in 1776 from Great Britain was, as she said, because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. Not that they wanted to be independent, not that they wanted to be free, not that they wanted to have liberty, none of that. What they really staged the revolution to do was to protect the institution of slavery. According to her reasoning, the thing which was the great threat to Americans was not decisions about taxes or decisions about tea or even the king. The real threat which triggers the American Revolution is a decision in the British courts in 1772 called the Somerset decision, because it involved a slave named James Somerset who had been brought by his master from Jamaica to Britain and who sued for his freedom in Britain. The Somerset case came up before Lord Chief Justice Mansfield. He ordered the freeing of Somerset on the grounds that slavery was not a legal condition in the British Isles. Well, according to Hannah-Jones, that decision stimulated a panic among slaveholders in the American colonies. Suddenly, they saw Great Britain moving towards emancipation. And rather than have that happen, that was what incited Americans to bolt for independence before the Somerset decision could be applied to them. There are, however, two forbidding problems with this assertion. First, as a number of prominent historians of early America have observed, there's no evidence that the Somerset decision played a role in any American's decision to support the revolution. In fact, there's not really much evidence that many Americans even noticed the Somerset decision. And far from the British Empire somehow moving in an emancipation direction, the British Empire as a whole remained committed to slavery all through the empire for many decades thereafter. The Somerset decision only covered the British Isles themselves. In fact, the largest resistance to the Somerset decision came not from Americans. It came from slave owners in the British West Indies, where slavery was conducted on a far greater scale and for far greater profits in sugar. And yet, the funny thing is, the British West Indies chose deliberately not to join the American revolutionaries in 1776. Now, if defending slavery from the Somerset decision, as the 1619 Project claims, if that was the real issue of the American Revolution, then nobody should have been more eager to throw in their lot with the 13 colonies than Jamaica, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, but they didn't. In fact, so far was defending slavery from the minds of the American revolutionaries that one historian, whom a New York Times fact checker did consult on the subject, Leslie Harris of Northwestern University, Harris advised the Times fact checker not to go out on that limb because there was nothing to support it, not to make the assertion. Well, Hannah Jones ignored the advice. And Harris, in March of 2020, went public with her complaint in Politico, and that forced the New York Times Magazine to make a humiliating concession of its mistake in what it called an update, which it issued on March 11th. So the errors, the historical errors, the 1619 Project made in its effort to bend and pack all of American history into this little box was immediately seen by historians as being off the deep end. And so the objections came in. The problem was the New York Times kept resisting and kept refusing to do anything until finally the weight of it and the publicity from it became too great. And very grudgingly, beginning in March, the New York Times Magazine and the Times itself begins to make concessions. The concessions begin to multiply. People begin to notice that the New York Times website that had the 1619 Project on it was making these quiet, surreptitious changes in the 1619 Project. And then finally, just over this past weekend, a New York Times op-ed staffer, Brett Stevens, published a lengthy op-ed about the 1619 Project in which he summed up all the critiques that had been made about historical errors in the 1619 Project and said flat out, the 1619 Project has failed. So there are serious historical problems with the 1619 Project. And it took a long time of drawing attention to these before the Times would admit it. But now we're starting to see the cracks even in the facade of the New York Times as it realizes that what it has on its hands is a kind of historical fairy tale, an origin story, as Lenny says, a narrative, as some people like to use the term, but one which approaches the boundaries of historical fiction more than representing history.
So, Lenny, why do you think they're doing this?
Because there's an opportunity for individuals to try to find a heightened level of esteem at a time where people are feeling more and more separated from the American dream. But this is not the way to do it. You know, more often than not, you find that instances and examples within the 1619 Project are shooting more towards esteem for our contemporary citizens versus looking back throughout our history to see what citizens and non-citizens did in order to make America better. For example, if you look at the situation around the hearing in 1772 in Britain, and you talk about the freeing of Somerset, and you look at the result that was supposedly happening in the colonies to get them to a revolutionary fervor and thus a revolutionary war. At that same exact time, in the colony of Massachusetts, you had their courts allowing a slave to petition for her freedom as well and win freedom there also. You had this happening in several different states. You had the anti-slavery movement here with Quakers and others in Pennsylvania. In fact, if you look at American history in totality, you already started seeing the separation of the 13 original colonies, where the further south you went, the more reliant they were on slavery as a primary industry. And the further north you went, there started to see a subsiding of slave numbers just from a natural erosion of the practice and what made sense for the region from an economic standpoint. You start looking at other examples of what was going on out there as far as freeing of slaves in certain states, just the willingness to let go of slaves, whether it was due to religious reasons, or just pure economic reasons as to what made sense for those colonies going through the 1700s. And again, you found this in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and in other states further north. So when you start asking, why would the 1619 Project ignore all these good historical stories where you can find primary sources, secondary sources, and give kids, and let's be honest, Joan and Dr. Guelzo, and those of you out there joining us tonight, we're talking about how we're influencing our kids to think about our nation moving forward. And that means everything from whether they'll serve our country or not in the military to whether they believe they're going to get a fair shake to create a business, to do well in school, to try to prosper as a self-sufficient American, or if they're going to take a level of lack of self-esteem in our nation where they don't salute the flag, they don't feel like they need to vote, they feel like they can't make a difference. The 1619 Project is trying to create a sense of value for people that are going through hard times now, but they're taking the wrong approach. In fact, if they took the historical approach towards our history, they would see that there are so many individuals from all different backgrounds, creeds, colors, and the like that have gone through similar instances, in some instances worse, and were able to overcome and make our nation stronger as a result, whether it's in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, where I'm a native of, all the way through to shore here in these United States.
So, Alan, from your perspective, why does it matter? Why is this not just some sort of a topic that is argued among historians?
Well, you might think on the surface, oh, this is just another historical tempest in teapot. Let's watch the professors and the historians throw things at each other. My response to that is historical tempests actually mean a great deal to Americans. I mean, our identity as Americans is not based on blood or soil or language or religion or race. Our identity as Americans is derived from the propositions of the Declaration of Independence and the laws in the Constitution. This is what Lincoln said at Gettysburg in November of 1863. This was a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. It's from those propositions, it's from those laws, and from the way that we have fought for the freedoms that they express and protect, and fought in the Revolution, in the Civil War, in 2 world wars. If those propositions and that freedom are not the basis of our identity, then confidence in the entire American experiment in liberty is in jeopardy. How can we expect people to have any confidence in this experiment in liberty if, in fact, it's really not founded on the things we thought it was, but instead is founded on slavery? I think the 1619 Project hopes to remove that original foundation and move it in a different direction for a number of self-interested reasons. Some of them are motivated, I think, by politics and economics, because the 1619 Project is very candid about saying that the history of the American economy all grew out of slavery. Capitalism, American enterprise, all of that, entrepreneurship, all of that has grown out of slavery. Well, if you can say that, if you can teach that in schools, if you can put into the heads of students in a K through 12 curriculum that an entrepreneurial, open economy is really the equivalent of slavery, then it becomes easier to recommend something like socialism as the alternative to the rising generation of Americans. And I think, too, that the project has been part of a general push for slavery reparations. And that's something that Nicole Hannah-Jones has been very candid about. She actually followed up the 1619 Project with a lengthy essay back in June in the New York Times Magazine, What is Owed? And that was an argument for reparations. So the project moves along as part of a justification for a call for reparations for slavery. So there's elements of self-interest, there's elements of ideology that go into the energies that stand behind the 1619 project. But what is going to be the fundamental result? The fundamental result is going to be to put a gigantic question mark into the minds of people about the real identity of the American experiment. And it will start with the K through 12, because the 1619 project not only has appeared as this supplement to the New York Times, but there are plans in the works now. Some of them, in fact, are already in operation for promoting the 1619 project as a K through 12 history curriculum. There are approximately 3,500 schools which have adopted aspects of the 1619 project. For that matter, there are at least 5 major urban school districts as a whole which have adopted elements of the 1619 project: Washington, D.C., Buffalo, New York, Chicago, Illinois. Once students from the very beginning of their school experience are being taught that the American experiment is a lie, that it is not about liberty, but it is about enslavement, oppression, and exploitation, then what conclusion do we expect them to come to as these children, the rising generation, come to maturity and take up the burden of citizenship themselves? I don't think the result is going to be terribly happy, and the 1619 project will be one major factor in creating that unhappiness.
And Joan, if I may add to that, one of the things that is missed in regards to teaching history in the way that the 1619 project tries to do that is it overlooks how we truly look at American history. True patriots of our country don't look at our history as a perfect history. Even in our founding documents, it talks about the pursuit of a more perfect union. There's an expectation that we're never quite where we need to be. We rob kids, particularly K through 12, that are starting to learn these type of things, of understanding that we have a flawed history, but it's the values. Not to Dr. Guelzo's point. Again, it's not a language, it's not a skin tone. It's not one shared background. It's the true essence of the melting pot that is brought together through a shared set of values and a common history that is both flawed yet inspiring, full of tragedies and triumphs, full of manifest destiny and fatal flaws from everybody from presidents to governors and all the way down through. But yet we still have the moxie to inspire the world. That we won World War II, but we also had segregated troops, that we had to deal with that type of social issue once we came home, that we had to heal through the Civil War. We didn't quite do the best job we could have done, and thus the regression that we had decades afterwards. But yet there's something to be learned. There are heroes in every corner of our country, and they come from all different backgrounds. That's the essence of America, because again, all of those individuals were chasing values. For example, you talk about the scourge of racism in America, and the 1619 project builds upon a foundation saying that racism is everywhere and that everything within our founding documents and our founding steps is flawed. And yet, if you look at American history and you go back to the civil rights movement of the 20th century, all of the steps for success were built upon going back to the Constitution as people living through Jim Crow segregation and forcing America to be true to its promise, and finding Americans from all corners of the nation to be willing to hold America to that promise. There are examples of that all littered throughout our history. But if you're more willing to chase feelings and not chase sentiments, and not chase lessons learned as a nation as we move forward, not just what we do as adults, but how we teach the next generation how to be adult American citizens, we run the risk of losing America. There's a reason why, and Dr. Guelzo brings it up, there's a reason why more and more young people are polling and saying that let's give socialism a try. Free college, free health care. Let's make sure we have guaranteed wages. That's not how we get medical breakthroughs. That's not how we get new industries. That's not how we create wealth. That's never been the way we have created wealth and run the global economy for 100 years in the United States. It's been through our spirit. And that goes back to a unifying origin, flaws and all. When we don't continue with the 1776 spirit of who we are, we lose all of that. And at a time where this world is being more divided, we can't afford to take any more steps back.
Lincoln, just to extend what Lenny was saying, Lincoln talked about that spirit of independence when in 1858, he said fully half the people living in the United States today came from someplace else. He said if they try to make a connection between themselves and the revolution by blood or by ancestry or by family, they're not going to be able to do it because they came from someplace else, fully half the population. But, Lincoln said, if they pick up the Declaration of Independence and they read what those old men wrote in that old declaration, that all men are created equal, when they read that, Lincoln said, then they feel that they are blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the American revolutionaries, and so they are. That is the spirit we want to communicate. It's the spirit that moved 8,000 African Americans to fight in the Continental armies during the American Revolution. Not very far away from where we are here in Philadelphia, in Valley Forge, there's a monument just a stone's throw from the Washington Memorial Chapel. It's to the 2 regiments of African Americans that were part of the encampment at Valley Forge during that dreadful winter. And that monument remembers those regiments. It remembers those thousands of Black men who fought for the American Revolution. Now, if the American Revolution had been created for the purpose of protecting slavery, what exactly were they doing? What did they think they were doing? Do we have to suppose that they had no idea what they were doing? No, they understood what the revolution was about. They understood what it pointed to for the future, and it was a future they wanted to be part of. In the Civil War, 180,000 African Americans are part of the Union armies. And when they go into action for the first time, they are going to prove that they deserve the title deeds to American citizenship fully as much as anyone else. Sergeant William Kearney of the 54th Massachusetts helps to lead that attack. That attack fails, but he brings back the colors of the regiment. He's got 3 wounds. He staggers into an aid station, and he says, "The old flag never touched the ground, boys." That's the spirit we want to inculcate, not the spirit of despair, which is what 1619 is about, but the spirit of hope and liberty. And that is what Lenny has been describing. That is what Lincoln described. That is what that monument at Valley Forge reminds us of. And that, I think, is what we have to put at the center of our teaching of American history.
And there's one, and if I may, John, just very quickly, there's one other essence that we're missing 1619 versus 1776. When you talk about 1619, we're talking about mandates in regards to who's human, who is not, who is citizen, who is not, based on man. 1776, and then the Constitution a decade afterwards, talks about God-given rights. And African Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, Chinese Americans, they understood God-given rights and were willing to become American citizens for the guarantee of those God-given rights to be enjoyed by way of the United States Constitution. If you move away from the origin story and the essence, the unifying essence of 1776, and you go to 1619, you go away from protecting God-given rights, and now you go back to man-driven rights and responsibilities. And every other government in history prior to America tried it that way with less than favorable results.
So Lenny, I'd like to hear both of you address a question that I think many of our viewers are asking in their minds, and it's certainly in mine. What do we do about it?
Well, one thing I would jump in to say that we can do about it, first of all, is to be aware of how the 1619 Project is being promoted in our schools and to speak out against it. For those of you who attend school board meetings, for those of you who know teachers, for those of you who are trustees of private schools or charter schools, please be aware of what the blandishments of the 1619 Project represent and oppose them. Read through these materials, study the objections that have been raised, and be prepared to say, no, the 1619 Project is an exercise in folly. It is not going to build up. It is only going to tear down. And do it right at that very basic level, right at the grassroots level. In fact, even more than a grassroots level, within your own homes. Talk to your children about American history. Now, you don't have to be a professional historian to do that. You can talk about Washington, about Lincoln, about Frederick Douglass, about Harriet Tubman. You can go through many great stories about American leaders. And those are stories which testify to the primacy of the search for liberty, the passion for freedom. Do that in your homes and by your hearthsides. Heavens knows, my grandmother did it for me when I was knee-high to her, literally. I'm in first grade. I'm getting the lessons that she learned when she was a girl at the George Clymer School in Philadelphia. Pass these lessons on in your households, in your families, to, as it was said, even in the words of Shakespeare, let this be the story that the good man teaches his son. Pass this along in your homes. Pass it along, safeguard it in your schools. Start there. Now, Lenny, I'm sure, has another set of recommendations because he's got much more experience than I do dealing with K through 12 curriculum. So I'll turn the floor over to him gladly.
Well, Dr. Guelzo, thank you so much. I think one other big thing that we all can do is understand the premise of the 1619 Project from a human perspective. This started because people were looking to find themselves in American history, but they were looking in the wrong directions and inclined to make things up rather than stick to the history and dig a little deeper. If you understand some of the human pain, some of the feeling of loss and separation that many people that are inclined to embrace the 1619 Project are going through, it's very easy to resolve this. One of the things we have to do is find the everyday history around us and find the story that connects to our youth within the everyday history around us. All youth, regardless of where they're from, want to feel important, want to feel loved, want to feel valued, and want to see that they have a place where they are and where they're going. It's on us to teach American history better. We have not done this well over the last several decades. And so when you alienate certain portions of our country because we don't teach our history in a rich fashion, in a full fashion, or in a way that shows all of the facts, warts and all, but shows the inspiration through it all, you end up leading to things like this. And then you take some of the divisive times we've gone through over the last decade, and here we are with a massive origin story parading around as curriculum for history K through 12. Understand the everyday history around you. Understand that people are looking for their ties to that everyday history and show them in those stories. Don't try to make Paul Revere relate to a black kid from Pittsburgh. Show how there were African Americans in Pittsburgh that helped make America great in 1776, 1876, 1976, through the malaise of the 70s on through to the glory days of the 80s and the 90s and the better days ahead.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for your insights. I'm going to move to take a few questions from some of our viewers. One that I think is very interesting is there a code of journalistic conduct or something akin to a code of ethics that has been violated by the New York Times when it altered the 1619 Project in a significant way without notification?
Well, I would say yes, there is a serious problem here. And the serious problem, it emerges out of the fact that you say one thing and then when you realize that what you have said publicly is wrong, you don't come out and admit it. Oh, we were wrong. No, you try to alter it. You try to airbrush it. This is a tactic out of the old Stalinist days when they would take photographs of people who were inconvenient, but who were seen at various points with Stalin. Well, they redid the photographs. They airbrushed those people out. This is what the New York Times was doing. Is this a violation of journalistic ethics? I would certainly say so. Is it the kind of thing that would merit the review of a Pulitzer Prize? The National Association of Scholars has certainly said so and has issued a public letter asking the Pulitzer Board to reconsider the award of a Pulitzer Prize for commentary to Nicole Hannah-Jones. Now, I think there are serious problems this way. In fact, if you consult the Washington Post today, there is a major feature story about the 1619 Project. It's not complimentary. There's a certain extent to which I think the Post was almost enjoying itself at the New York Times' expense. But in the very end of the story, Nicole Hannah-Jones, perhaps unwisely, admits to the author of the Post story that, yes, she was somewhat careless in what she wrote in the 1619 Project. Well, I'm sorry, but you don't give Pulitzer Prizes for carelessness. So should this be revisited? Is there a standard that you can hold the New York Times to? Well, unfortunately, there is no objective court of publications. I mean, we have a guarantee of the free exercise of speech for our newspapers and for the press in the United States. So we don't have a court that sits and makes an adjudication. That is up to the people themselves, who are the readers and the purchasers of the New York Times. So can we force the Times to do anything? No, and I would be against an effort to try to force the New York Times to say something. But I would say keep the questions coming, keep the weight of embarrassment in front of the New York Times, so that at some point the New York Times finally, for the sake of its own reputation, if it still is interested in that, is able to say we were wrong. And at that point, we've accomplished a great deal.
So, Lenny, another question has come up that says, are there any schools in the Philadelphia area that have adopted 1619 into their history curriculum?
From what I am aware, there are some schools that are considering it. I am not aware of it being part of the curriculum at this point in time. I do know, as Dr. Guelzo had mentioned, that there are already several cities that have done this. So this is something that's becoming a wave coming into the school systems throughout the country now. As we well know, and not to sound too partisan, but we're already seeing other types of influences coming in a same or similar fashion in the bigger school districts throughout the United States. And for example, during the pandemic, there was information circulated in the Philadelphia schools that were clamoring against Catholic schools, private schools, charter schools, which had nothing to do with curriculum of kids that were going through a pandemic and couldn't go to school for 6 weeks. But yet this was now seen as being part of their study guide. So this is another attempt to try to put a political or a philosophical bent on something that should be hard and loose. 2 + 2 is equal to 4. That's mathematics. Just the same with history. Things have happened that are hard and fast in history, that have primary and secondary sources. And you're starting to see the infiltration of the 1619 Project moving into more schools. Now, the good news is we have the 1776 Project that has been founded by Philadelphia native Bob Woodson, that is trying to push back on that. That's offering, again, these same schools a narrative saying, here is a curriculum that you can leverage, that you can count on, that has been vetted by historians, that does show the fullness of the American experience, so that your students, whether it's in inner city Philadelphia or in the suburbs, can find themselves in these stories and still truly learn about the American experience and be prepared to be better citizens moving forward.
So do either of you see any parallels, and this is a question from a viewer, between 1619 in our schools and programs built on the book White Fragility in our business culture to advance a more progressive philosophy?
I would think that there is somewhat of a parallel. I think that, again, it goes back to something I said earlier. There are people that are trying to explain the distance they feel between what some Americans experience and what other Americans experience. But if you're doing it in a way that is building upon the negativity, that's building upon the emotionalism, that's building upon the hurt and the fracture of where we are as a nation, and not building upon the successes we've had previously and solutions that we need, you end up having an explanation of symptoms without a cure. Or you have a cure that says, okay, you sprained your ankle, so we should cut your leg off. You won't have pain in your leg anymore, but you also won't have a leg. These are the types of things that we're starting to find from so-called experts that we need to really push back and say, let's take a step back. Let's talk about what real solutions are. Let's be honest about racism. Let's be honest about discrimination. Let's be honest about some of the things that we're seeing and we're still struggling with in our nation. But let's look at lessons learned. Let's look at where we can be contemporarily, and let's move forward with the types of solutions that could heal our nation and make us all more prosperous. I mean, if you look at some of the writings that are out there, you would get a tone and a sentiment that we're right back in 1950. And I oftentimes tell people that we're having these conversations 4 years after the first African-American president with a Muslim-sounding name served 2 terms in the presidency, from Chicago, no less. These are things that we have to leverage in our history and say, yes, things can be worse. Things have been bad. We're going through a hard time. And yet, because of the shoulders of those that have come before us, and we're standing on those shoulders, we don't quite have the same distance to go. And again, having a civic understanding history and our role in what we're creating with history today allows us to move forward with direction, with tact, and with unity as a united nation. And that makes a difference moving forward, particularly in this divisive election year.
So, Alan, you have anything to say about a parallel between white fragility and the business culture?
Well, I think there are definite parallels, because I think in a very distant way, both the 1619 Project and white fragility are both rooted in a single intellectual source, and that is something which is called critical race theory. Critical race theory, in turn, takes us back into the history of Marxism. Karl Marx, of course, prophesied a great proletarian revolution that was going to overthrow capitalism. And the moment when that was expected to happen was the First World War, because it was thought that all the working class people of the European nations would refuse to go to war, and they would rise up in revolution. Well, of course, they didn't. Instead, they went to war with each other. It was a disastrous war. But there was no revolution except in the place where capitalism had the feeblest hold, and that was Russia. So Marxists scratched their heads and tried to figure out why Marx was wrong. Well, the answer that was developed by Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, was, the real problem that Marx did not see, it was not the problem of class, it was the problem of culture, that capitalists controlled the culture. And because they controlled the culture, they made the working class adopt capitalist values. And that was why the working class didn't turn to revolution. That single insight, that it was all a matter of people not understanding what their real interests were because they were somehow blinded this way, that developed in the 1940s and the 1950s into critical theory. And critical theory developed into a number of separate schools. One of those schools was critical race theory. Critical race theory, just like what I've been describing previously, says the controlling factor in everyone's perception of everything is race. Anyone who says that race doesn't explain everything has just confessed that race explains everything. What am I hearing? I'm hearing a circular argument here, but critical theory always was circular. Critical race theory is circular. What you see in white fragility is that very same argument. White people are inherently racist. Any white person who says, I'm not racist, ipso facto, that means they're racist. So again, a circular argument. Anything which is adduced as evidence against that theory is immediately denounced as not evidence at all, but just an excuse. Well, what is 1619 saying? 1619 is saying something, historically speaking, very similar. It's saying everything in American history is about race. And anything you try to point to in American history and say, well, it's not about racial oppression. Oh, well, you just don't understand it. You're misguided. That's really about racial oppression after all. And we'll squeeze it into that box to make it seem that way. These things have all these parallel interchangeable parts. So when we talk about white fragility as it's being used in business and in academic culture, and when we talk about 1619, we're really talking about intellectual movements which have some common roots, and common roots which run back into 20th century Marxist thinking.
They're also rigid roots. They're not roots that allow for the evolution of thought, the evolution of society. And again,
Right.
The whole essence of the American experiment is the fact that because of the values, you can evolve a society from generation to generation where you can have these huge gains in prosperity, these huge gains in equality, and everything else, even from humble and less than desirable beginnings. And when you start talking about some of the theories that are out there, it removes the possibility for that. And whether you talk about our Christian roots, which talks about redemption, all the way through our secular roots, which talks about out of many come one, you have to make sure that America includes the ability to evolve, to have second chances, to be able to say, I was wrong about this. You know, there was a time where women couldn't vote in America. African Americans couldn't vote in America. We had slavery. We had codified oppression. We had state constitutions that did not want certain people from certain cultures to move into their state. And now we are the bastion of cultural just interblendedness. We are the shining city on a hill. That's not what necessarily we should have been if you just look at the facts and say they are cemented into place in America. The essence of 1776 constantly reminds us that there's an evolution and many interrelated, complex stories of human beings pursuing the enjoyment of their God-given rights, and thus the creation and advancement of the greatest nation this world has ever seen.
You know, what Lenny was just saying reminds me of something that Lincoln said. He was confronting an objector when he was talking about that fundamental proposition of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. And someone objected to him and said, well, it's obvious that in this society, we've got a lot of inequality. How do you explain that? And Lincoln's response was, well, let's understand something. In the Gospels, what do you read? You have Jesus saying to his disciples, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That didn't mean that he expected that they were going to be immediately perfect that way. No, Lincoln said, that was an aspiration. They were going to aspire towards that. They were going to try as much as they could and as hard as they could toward that standard of perfection. And they might not ever actually get entirely there, but they would keep moving more and more towards it. Now, Lincoln said that's exactly what we are confronting here when we're talking about equality in our society. When we look around, is everyone totally, perfectly, compatibly equal? No, but we can aspire to, we can work for it. And at least, Lincoln said, we can make sure that we never deny freedom to a slave, that we never impose slavery on someone else. That aspiration has been like a flame lit for generations of Americans to follow. And as Lincoln himself said, we must always be asking ourselves, can we do better? And the hope that is put forth in our documents, in our propositions, and in the example of our history, our real history, is the example of aspiration, of constantly moving forward in search of the realization of that basic proposition, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
And Dr. Guelzo, on top of that, there's an obligation to being an American citizen to pursue that on a regular basis. If you compare 1619 to 1776, there's an expectation that each American citizen in his or her own way is going to pursue that in a way that inspires, in a way that is true, in a way that seeks that equality constitutionally, as well as what we live secularly in our communities and in our everyday life. What exactly, in contrast, is the obligation from the 1619 Project? What exactly is the inspiration for America out of the 1619 Project? Those things are robbed from us. There is no longer a requirement for each one of us to be better, to be greater, like we have when we look back at 1776 and acknowledge American history from that as the unifying story that we all find as a foundation. It's that obligation for zeal, for justice, for equality, for the American spirit to lead the world through freedom that we need to continue to embrace and we need to share with future generations.
So, gentlemen, we only have a couple of minutes, and I do want to get your reaction to this question from one of our viewers. Is there anything of value in the 1619 Project?
I think that you can find value in the sentiment of the 1619 Project, which is, let's look at American history from a different perspective. Let's look at how something as institutionalized as slavery has impacted so many different things that we didn't realize that it impacted. Now, with that said, it's incumbent upon us to understand true history when we talk about that influence. I did an exercise when I was an adjunct professor at La Roche College here in Pittsburgh, where I made my class not only be Congress and the Senate for debate, but also made them investigate the remnants of this type of history on the shelves of Walmart, in products, the imagery. Understanding that doesn't mean that my students or that everybody that buys these products are inherently racist and they hate Black people. But it did make them understand that there are aspects of history that purport a lesser part of ourselves from our past that are still with us today. If the 1619 Project does that and then forces us to find facts in our history, then in that regard, this project has been a benefit for our society.
Thank you, Alan.
I would point to two things that I think are worth understanding and reading and using in 1619. One are the timelines. They're very useful timelines that were created, not by Nicole Hannah-Jones, but by some of the other contributors, and those timelines are valuable. I believe also some of the poetry is very compelling. And the poetry of African Americans and the contribution of African Americans to American literature that way is something which clearly has not been reckoned with fully. How many Americans today can talk with any kind of ease about the Harlem Renaissance? And yet the Harlem Renaissance is one of the great moments in American literature and African American literature. So there are some aspects of 1619 which I think are worth paying some attention to, worth using, but I have to look at it as a whole. And taking it as a whole, that's where the question marks come, especially the lead essays by Nicole Hannah-Jones, the economics essay by Professor Desmond. These, I'm afraid, which are the real heart of the 1619 Project, take us fundamentally astray.
So, gentlemen, I thank both of you, to Dr. Alan Guelzo, Lenny McAllister. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Like most of the Legacy Foundation's Liberty Series program, the content this evening has been extremely thought-provoking. And I will turn the program over to John Miko, who is Executive Director of the Legacy Foundation.
Thank you, Joan and Alan, Lenny. Thank you so much. My cell phone is going off with messages of who's this Lenny McAllister? Everyone knows Alan because he's been at the league. Who's this Lenny McAllister guy? And so we want to see both of you back, of course, in person at the league very, very soon. And gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, your talent, for sharing it, and for your passion, and for continuing to do what you do. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Lenny.
It's been an honor being on with all of you. Thank you all for tuning in today as well.
And for those of you who didn't watch the hearings today, I want to switch gears just slightly, because next week we're going to have, that's the confirmation hearings for Amy Barrett. We're going to have next week a program on the future, the past, present, and future of the Supreme Court. And actually, Professor Guelzo was quoted today, and he was correcting some facts or not some facts that came out in the vice presidential debate last week. So more on that next week when we hear from Michael Moreland and Michael Gerhardt on the past, present, and future of the Supreme Court. That's a public affairs program next Wednesday evening. And then on Tuesday, we actually have a library hour it's called Rest in Peace. And it's a look at those that are buried and maybe not so peacefully in our various cemeteries in Philadelphia, kind of a Halloween theme. And I think you'll want to tune in for that. So again, my thanks to Joan, Alan, and Lenny. And there's lots of things to talk about and to expand on. And I would encourage those who are interested in things like voting rights, women's suffrage, African-American suffrage, and the path forward on these to come to our exhibit, which just opened a couple of weeks ago, called Ballot Box, America's Fight for the Vote, here in the Heritage Center. We are open. We hope to see you soon. And until next week, have a great evening. Thank you.